Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 87 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin. Mike and Fia are off this week, but fortunately, I work at a pretty cool place, Bucknell University, and even though I'm relatively new there is also somebody else who just recently got hired in our geology department. And fortunately, also, she is a specialist in a topic that I have been wanting to do an episode on for a long time, which is paleoclimate. So we are lucky enough today to be joined by Dr. Lorelei Curtin. I am very excited for this episode. And but before we get into our actual conversation with Lorelei, we have a message from Mike.
Hello everybody, Mike here once again on an update on my attempt to try and hike the 46 high peaks in the Adirondacks this summer. Last week on Wednesday, I was able to do those 4 peaks that I said I wanted to try and do. That was Dial, Nippletop, Colvin, and Blake. The weather was supposed to be clear. It was not. It was raining and wet the entire time, and I did not enjoy it. That combined with the fact that my knee really is starting to bother me now. I ended up going home that same day, and I am trying to let it rest for at least another couple of days after that. So I'm not entirely sure what the future holds. Summer is starting to wrap up, and I'm kind of running out of days. I'm up to 31 total mountains so far. I have 15 more to do, and I'm not entirely sure how many more I'll be able to get to, but I'm going to try and get back out there at least a couple of more times this summer, as long as the knee is willing. But that's where things currently stand. We're up to 31 with just a couple weeks left in summer. All the best to you guys, and back to Gavin and Fia.
Thank you for that update, Mike. I also definitely feel the summer coming to an end. If you're listening to this the day or the weekend that it goes out, students have arrived on campus by this point. New freshman students arrived today, the day we're recording this, and it made campus a complete zoo. And this coming Monday is the first day of classes. So I am very glad that Lorelei and I got to find a time before classes started to actually sit down and record this. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully you will too. But before we get into the actual content of the episode, I'd like to ask you to rate this podcast on whatever platform you listen to it on. We're really trying to grow this podcast, and we can't really do it without listeners like you. So if you enjoy the podcast, please send it to all your friends who are interested in paleontology, earth sciences, or even just, biology in general. And also check out some of the links down below in the show notes. We have lots of forms to suggest future guests or future topics, as well as links to all of our social media, which we'd also really appreciate you to check out. So with all of that stuff out of the way, here is my conversation with Dr. Lorelei Curtin. So I am here with Dr. Lorelei Curtin, one of my new coworkers. And first of all, I like to say it's just really nice to also have a new person at a job.
Oh my gosh, it's so nice.
Yeah, to just have somebody to commiserate all the things of being a new person.
Getting lost on campus all the time. Yep.
Exactly. But yeah, so go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Gavin. So my name's Lorelei, and as Gavin said, I am a new person at Bucknell. I just started as an assistant professor. I came to geology in, I think, a way that a lot of people do, which is that I took an intro geology class in college just out of interest. Most people don't have a lot of geology in high school. And it just blew my mind. So it really just kind of snowballed after that intro class. I was still, pretending I was pre-med and was taking all these geology classes. And by the time I was a junior, I kind of was like, oh gosh, I guess I'm just going to be a geologist forever. And here we are. So yeah, I did a bachelor's in geology and then went on and did grad school in paleoclimate, which is a field I honestly didn't have very much exposure to in undergrad, but it kind of combined a lot of my favorite things about a bunch of different fields. So using sort of the geology and the historical perspective, but also kind of having a little bit of a direct connection to the current climate crisis. So
Right.
yeah, that's how I got here.
Awesome. Yeah, and the fact that most high schools don't have like geology of some kind of blew my mind, because as I later learned, New York is
Yeah.
one of the few states that require it as part of their high school curriculum.
Yeah, I think, I learned the 3 types of rocks in like 7th grade, and that was about
Yeah.
it. But yeah, New York has an earth science requirement, and
hmm
most places do not. I'm not sure if any other state does.
I, I I have
So
so many friends who are earth science teachers, and I think there's at least one more state that does,
mhm.
but it's definitely not Pennsylvania where I live
Yeah.
now. Because I do a lot of volunteer work, um, with like sophomore age high school students,
Mhm.
and they're all like, "Oh yeah, no, I definitely never taken." Like some schools have it as like an elective, but yeah,
Yeah, and I
that's kind of a
think
shame.
it is a shame because, you get a lot of kids that come in knowing they want to do chemistry, or knowing they want to do biology, or I want to do physics because those were my favorite high school classes. And we
hmm
don't really have that advantage as a geology department, thinking about how we're going to suck kids in.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think, it's something that's definitely lacking in our education. So I was pretty excited, when I was a freshman in college, just to, I happened to meet a geology professor and took a geology class. And I feel pretty lucky that I just kind of stumbled upon this passion that I didn't know that I would have.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of how I stumbled into it too. I knew I wanted to do paleontology, but I definitely wanted to come at it from more the biological side.
Mm,
The more evolution, anatomy, and then the more I learned about it, it's like, okay, you need both.
yeah.
Like you can preferentially choose one, but you need both. Um, and so that's why I like talking about some of the more geological aspects of paleontology on the podcast, because I feel like that's talked about a lot less, and that's sort of where paleoclimate sort of falls in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I guess with that, let's just sort of get into the topic. So what
Sure.
exactly, before we get into paleoclimate, what is climate?
Yeah. So climate is basically the average conditions in a given region, the average weather conditions. And that's a pretty important distinction. You know, climate change is something that happens relatively slowly when you compare it to, sort of the day to day changes in weather. So if it's raining today, it might not rain tomorrow, but that doesn't mean the climate has changed.
Right.
And I think a lot of confusion comes from that, especially in terms of, understanding climate change, because, people say, oh, well, if you can't even predict the weather tomorrow, then do you know what the
Mm,
climate's going to be like in 50 years? But
right.
they're really just operating on different timescales and there's a lot more sort of randomness that we don't understand about weather that doesn't exist in the climate system. So we have a better ability to predict climate than we do weather. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what the climate system is. It's the surface of the earth moving around, basically, is what climate is.
Okay. And so what kind of things, just, going in brief, makes it so, for example, central/eastern Pennsylvania, is generally a bit, wetter, not so much this summer. The summer's been pretty
Yeah.
dry, than say where I just moved from, Southern California.
Sure. So the one of the main factors you have to think about, proximity to water, which is funny because Southern California, you're very close to the
Right.
water, right?
hmm
But which direction the wind blows over that water is really important. So if you have, general wind patterns that are bringing moist air from the subtropics into a region, which we do have in Pennsylvania, then you'll have a relatively wet climate. And that is not really the case in
Right.
Southern California. So Southern California is just missing sort of that warm subtropical moisture that we get to enjoy here in Pennsylvania.
Enjoy is some
Yeah,
days a
enjoy is
little too strong of a
yeah.
term. And so since you brought up weather a little earlier, I guess what is, the big difference between weather? You talked about, a bit about the predictability aspect of it, but, weather is sort of the day to day, whereas climate is the longer trends.
Yeah, so weather
Yeah.
is really just day-to-day changes in the atmosphere that affect us a lot in our day-to-day lives. Whereas
Yeah.
climate is sort of those changes averaged over, 30-ish years and longer. And climate really, it involves processes that are much slower moving than the atmosphere. So the atmosphere, winds blow around, the atmosphere changes on a day-to-day basis. When you get to thinking about climate, you often involve the ocean, and the ocean changes a lot
Right.
slower than the atmosphere. So the climate system really is sort of the coupled ocean and atmospheric system that has it's a little bit slower moving. But it really is just sort of longer term changes we think about as climate changes versus weather, which, from the day to day, the morning to night, those sorts of things.
Yeah. And I remember, I haven't heard it in quite a while, but always that sort of retort to whenever you're talking about climate change, where people say, oh, the weather is always changing, the climate's
Yeah.
always changing, which is like, yeah, you are technically correct,
Mm-hmm.
but the science is what tells us that the climate has always changed. So why do people not use the science now?
Yeah.
But I guess let's talk a little bit about paleoclimate now, which is, I guess, how we know that the climate has always been changing.
Yeah. So paleoclimate, just like paleontology, is just ancient climates of the past. So it's a really interesting subject because you think about, if we want to know how different is today's climate, if we're going to say the climate's always been changing, how different is today's climate from what it's been in the past? We don't have a way to go back in time with a thermometer and take a
Right.
temperature measurement or measure the rainfall in central Pennsylvania or in Southern California. So paleoclimate is kind of the field that came out to kind of understand really how climate has changed in the past. And that's not quite the same as, geology, which is focused usually more on sort of deeper earth processes.
Mhm.
But we do use geology and modern climate science to kind of combine those two things to understand the climate in the past.
So, like you said, you can't just, time travel a thermometer or a hygrometer, barometer, whatever.
Yeah, we
back-
wish,
back-
but
Right. So, what are some of the challenges other than that of, just, studying the paleoclimate as opposed to, the modern climate?
Sure. So I think one advantage of modern climate is that you can make as many measurements as you want and you can, funding limited. But, if I wanted to know
Right.
what the temperature was in the South Pacific today, you would just take the temperature. And those data sets, they're these huge data sets and we have so much information. So kind of one of the struggles with modern climate is how to deal with all of that data. And modern climate scientists are really just these like big data scientists that are
Mhm.
synthesizing all these different data sets and figuring out how they relate to each other and looking at trends that we can see over, the last 10, 15, 20, 60, 70 years, as long as we have
Right.
data. And then they're also, I think one thing that's very different is they are able to project that forward. So they come up with these physical models. It's basically a very complicated physical problem where they can put in this modern data to sort of calibrate the models and say, okay, so if we know that the climate has been like this for the last 150 years, what does my computer say the climate's going to be like in 100 years? And paleoclimate, although it's becoming, there's more and more data every day, and we learn something new from every data set, the data sets are generally much smaller. And it's a lot more labor intensive to collect paleo data because you can't just go out with a thermometer. You have to go to the middle of the South Pacific or the middle of Southern California and find the right kind of archive and measure the correct proxy to answer the question that you're interested in. So they're both challenging in their own ways, for sure, and both interesting. And I think, paleoclimatologists collaborate with climate modelers and modern climate scientists all the time. And I think there's a lot of sort of communication between those two communities because we both really do help each other.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure the modern, climatologists, I guess, would that be neo-climatologists?
Yeah, we'll call them that.
Sure. I'm sure they benefit also just from, bigger data sets in the past as well.
Yeah.
From paleoclimate.
For
to
sure.
Make their
And that's
models more accurate.
Exactly. So that's kind of one of the main reasons why paleoclimate data is important, is because, if I have data that says, well, central Pennsylvania was this amount colder 100,000 years ago, the climate modelers can run their model backwards and they say, oh, well, my model says it was warmer, not colder. And that tells you that either my data's wrong or there's something wrong with the model. And that's the same model they're using to run forward to predict future climate change. So it gives, kind of both communities the ability to really better understand how the climate system works.
Awesome. And since you mentioned them a little bit ago, let's talk about proxies a little bit.
Sure.
So I guess firstly, what is a proxy?
Yeah, so a proxy, because we can't go back in time and measure the temperature or the amount of rainfall or the humidity in the air, we have developed all sorts of systems to measure that without measuring it. So one example that a professor of mine in grad school used she said, okay, so if you're sitting in your house and you want to know what the temperature is outside, but you're too lazy to go outside, you could look out your window, and if you see a bunch of people walking down the sidewalk wearing parkas and mittens and hats and snow boots, you have a pretty good, you could probably guess that it's cold outside. So you haven't actually gone outside and measured anything, but just by counting the number of hats outside, you could make a guess as to how cold it is. Or, if you look outside and everyone's wearing shorts and tank tops and there's no hats to be seen, then you have a pretty good idea it was warm outside. So you can use like people's clothing outside as a proxy for the outside temperature, even though you haven't actually measured it. So with proxies in the paleo world, we do the same thing. So we measure something in our archive, which I can get into in a minute, that tells us what the temperature was at the time. So just like as an example, a proxy that I really love, I work on lake sediments. Lakes are amazing because they're pretty much ubiquitous. You can find a lake almost anywhere, especially in the upper parts of the northern hemisphere where there was a giant ice sheet a while ago. Yep. And one of the proxies that I use are called alkenones, and these are an organic molecule that are produced by algae that live in the water. And depending on the temperature, the algae produce this compound with different numbers of double bonds between the carbon atoms. So when it gets colder, there's more double bonds, and when it gets warmer, there's fewer double bonds. So we can go back layer by layer in the sediment and measure the concentration of those compounds and reconstruct the temperature just based on the number of double bonds in the organic molecules. So even though, we haven't gone back for the last 10,000 years and measured the temperature with a thermometer, we can essentially do that just by measuring these organic compounds in a sediment, basically.
Interesting. I've never heard of that kind of proxy before. So that's really neat. There's all sorts of different biomarkers that I use
Yeah.
for, a variety of
Yeah, so that's one example.
paleoclimate
And
things.
people use, microfossils. So because different in the ocean, people use microfossils from plankton a lot because they grow everywhere in the ocean, and
Yep.
different species grow at different temperatures. So it's another way to really kind of pin down what the ocean conditions were like in the past, just by looking at microfossils. But that also works with pollen. We
Hmm.
it causes our allergies, but it also gets deposited into all sorts of sediments. And
Right.
knowing what the plants were like in a certain place tells you a bit about the climate too. So there's all sorts of different types of climate proxies. Um, they're all useful in their own way. They all have their own strengths and
Yeah.
weaknesses. But when you put a bunch of them together, you end up with, sort of a more clear picture of what the climate system was like in the past.
Yeah, the kinds that I'm more familiar with, or with that I would let me rephrase, that I would actually be able to interpret,
Mm-hmm.
uh, would be, as we had an episode about the geologic timescale and the difference between absolute dating and relative dating,
Yeah.
and would be things like relative proxies, or things that I would be more comfortable with. For example, uh, things like a lot of anatomical proxies of things like, so if you look at this group of animals, you know, 10 million years ago, their
Mm-hmm.
teeth are much more adapted to things like browsing, eating leaves. And then as you move forward, they get more adapted to eating grass. And
Yeah.
because you know that trees need more water than grasses, you can sort of infer that there was less water available through time. And that's,
Yeah.
you don't know how much, and that's what makes it a relative
Mm-hmm.
proxy. Or you could even just directly use the plants for that. We know certain types of plants need more water than others. So if you find plant fossils that, if you find lots of mosses that need water to reproduce, need lots of water, or they just can't exist, versus a grass, you know there must have been a lot of water versus less water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's been a big push, not super recently, I would say over the last 30 years, to really to quantify those relative proxies.
Hmm.
So like I mentioned pollen as an example. That's something that used to be used, kind of as, well, it used to be an evergreen pine forest, and now it's more of like a deciduous, oak dominated forest, which tells us it probably warmed up and maybe got a little bit wetter. And now there's, these really careful calibrations to really better understand, okay, what does it take to shift that forest regime from one type to the other? And dependent on the percentage of all of those pollen types, what does that tell you exactly about, the temperature? And it can even really get down to seasonal temperatures. Because all of those plants have preferences. They like to grow in, maybe mild summers and cold winters, or they like really hot summers, or, those sorts of things. That it's a lot of really intriguing information that that the paleo community has been working on to really quantify changes, as opposed to just kind of observing qualitative changes.
Yeah, and I feel like that's just been a general trend in a lot of the geosciences, is
Mm,
trying to be a lot more quantitative,
yeah.
because just historically, um, especially compared to things like chemistry or physics, the natural sciences have been much more observational. That's something that I caught a lot of flack for when I
Mm,
was presenting my master's thesis
yeah.
project to the rest of the geology department,
Yeah.
because mine was just updating a lot of taxonomy
Yep.
on a collection of fossils from a particular site. And they were like, well, what's your hypothesis? And I'm like, I kind of don't have one. And they were like, you need to do better. And I was like,
Yep.
well, it's so, which is a good thing, having actual numbers behind your information makes it, much more robust and believable and repeatable, which is the whole point of science.
Yep. Yeah, I think, there's a fine line, and there's always a place for that sort of observational science, and I think that's where a lot of geoscientists get into the field is, especially I think, it is also an issue of diversity where, a lot of people grow up in this world being told you're bad at math, ugh, you're a woman, you're just bad at math, sucks. And, so people who have been sort of excluded from those communities may feel a draw to a science where it doesn't appear to be quite so quantitative, but it turns out, yeah, we're just fine at math. You just, so I think, yeah, that's one thing about geology that I really do love, is that it's about interpreting the world around you, right? And you don't always need to put a number on that for it to be useful. But it is, when you're trying to compare paleoclimate data to modern climate data, you do need to have some numbers, unfortunately. Right. But the field is getting better at that.
Yeah, the neo-climatologists are, I feel like they do much less of the observational. So if you want to keep up with the quote unquote big dogs, you gotta have some numbers.
Exactly.
So, I guess you mentioned earlier that you work on lake sediments.
Yeah.
So what are some other sources? You mentioned, going out into the ocean and getting some sources there. So what are some of the sources of some of the best data or samples or whatever you happen to collect?
Sure. So all of these, the places where all of this information is stored, we call them archives, climate archives. And honestly, the best data and the best archive is going to depend on your question, first and foremost. So, if my question is about, I really am interested in the last 12,000 years. A lake is a really great place to answer that question in the Northern Hemisphere because they've usually been around for about 12,000 years. And they have enough resolution that you can get, a sample maybe every few decades or every 100 years or so. However, if you go to the ocean, the records are a lot longer. It's really incredible. We know things about the climate for the last, tens to hundreds of millions of years based on ocean sediments. However, you don't get the same resolution you do in a lake. So you might only be able to get a sample or a data point every few thousand years, if that. So that's just one example of, the resolution is very different between different types of archives. So that's kind of the first step, is trying to figure out what's the right archive for my question. Or, if you only work on lakes or you only work on ocean cores, what questions can I answer with this material? But another really important one that a lot of people know about are ice cores. So cores that are taken from the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet and a few, smaller ice caps, which tell you about temperature at the poles. And those records can, depending on which hemisphere you're in, they can, the Antarctic ice cores, they go back almost 1 million years. About 750,000 years. So it's a relatively long record of climate change that and we don't have an equivalent really on the land or in the ocean. But yeah, there's all sorts of different types of climate archives. People use tree rings to reconstruct climate. People use stalagmites that grow in caves to reconstruct climate. There's sort of a whole world out there of climate archives. Usually they're some sort of biologically mediated in a lot of situations where, where the example I gave of my proxy is, it's an algae that's making these molecules, but it could be plankton, it could be the tree, it could be, like you were saying, animals and parts of animals that tell you about the climate, or the plants that are making the pollen. Some of them are really just kind of straight up minerals. The stalagmites are just minerals that are deposited in stratigraphic order. And so you can measure the chemistry and get an idea of what the climate's doing. Same with ice cores. I consider ice a mineral. That may be controversial, but it is.
I think we actually we did an episode about the rock cycle as well.
Yeah.
And that blew my co-host Mike's mind, and I said that ice is in fact a mineral. And I'm like, technically also water, because it's, the same.
It's just liquid ice.
It's lava.
It's magma.
Water is
it's
lava.
Just lava, yeah. So, yeah, because the ice, it's not, there are things that live deep in the ice, but the proxies that we use are not really biological. It's just, the measuring the thickness of the ice layers or the chemistry of the ice layers tells you a lot about the climate.
Yeah. And so I know that all of these things that you've sort of mentioned, the lake cores, the ice cores, I think the highest, like, relatively specific number you've thrown around is give or take 1 million.
Yeah, and ocean cores can go back, as long as there's sediment on the ocean crust. So, maybe it's a few 100,000 years or 100 million years.
Yeah, I think the oldest
ocean crust is like 300 million years. Ish.
Oh, that's older than I was
really?
I thought it was sometime early Jurassic. I might be wrong.
I might be wrong too. But regardless,
those are kind of there's time before that.
There is a lot of time before that. And so for that we have to go to rocks.
And so how does that work? Because I know, like you were saying earlier, you can use the rocks to sort of interpret the environment.
Mm-hmm.
You can say these types of rocks only form in these environments, and we know that from, relatively recent times where we do have good, paleoclimate, usable information. And so just by the type of rock it is, we can sort of tell that it was in this kind of environment. But I guess, say you're trying to study back in the Cambrian or even the Precambrian for whatever reason, how do you figure that kind of stuff out?
It's really hard. Yeah, so like the deep time paleoclimatologists, I don't know how they do it, but a lot of it is really just geology. So I think one good example is like the Snowball Earth episodes in Earth's Past. Those are very old, but based on just the geology and the deposits, it tells us about the climate. So one thing you see during Snowball Earth is that basically all of the rocks are these diamictites, which are only produced by a glacier. So we know that, there were diamictites, there were glaciers all the way to the tropics during these Snowball Earth episodes. So we know it was really cold. But yeah, honestly, I don't know a ton about super deep time paleoclimate just because it is so hard to get at. I think there are some people who do things with like fluid inclusions and, thinking about like what kind of archives are even around from those really, really old rocks. You're pretty limited. I'm trying to think how old the organic proxies go back. I think they do go back. The organic material that I use in my work, some of it is it can be preserved for hundreds of millions of years.
Okay.
So I don't really know of many examples of using it to study the climate, but it's definitely there and people use it to understand life. And, if you have things making those molecules, life was around, basically.
Yeah. And I know, so I took a class in grad school called Paleo Environments.
Yeah.
And so the professor talked a lot about a couple of chemical proxies, specifically delta 13 carbon and delta 18 oxygen.
Yeah.
And so those are the ones that she focused on really heavily for some of the more deep time stuff. And so just really quick explainer, and I'm sure you're a little more familiar with them than I am, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But the delta 13 carbon basically just compares the ratio of light carbon to heavier carbon, and based on that, you can get a rough temperature or proxy of how much carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, which you can use to determine temperature. Like ballpark, less exact than things like your lake cores.
Sure. So it's an interesting, the carbon isotope proxies that deep in time, there's actually like huge debate over what they actually mean.
Okay.
So, but you are right that it is thought that they're related to the climate in some way. Most of the work that's been done, again, is on the neogene. But, if you can find carbonates, so carbon and oxygen preserved in, like really old soil horizons or, in cements, sandstone cements, you can measure them. There's still like really huge error bars on what it actually means in terms of the
Right.
amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And it's something that people are like really actively working on. One thing we do know about the carbon and the oxygen isotopes is that it does reflect sort of the amount of respiration happening. So the
Okay.
reason why the carbon isotopes tell you anything is because life, when things are growing, when photosynthesis is happening, photosynthesizers prefer to use carbon-12 versus carbon-13. It's easier to
Right.
make a carbon-carbon bond with carbon-12. So you can get some information about sort of the overall sort of almost the oxidation state
Okay.
of life. But, I mean, I'm not a deep time paleoclimatologist, so
Right.
there could definitely be sort of, there's links to temperature. I think the climate and the geology and life, there's a very close relationship between those things. So, if life is doing something, it's probably because of a climate or geology change.
Okay. And so, I guess sort of speaking of that, I guess you mentioned how it's all just sort of a big system. I think you specifically said, the atmosphere and the ocean, but so how does the climate affect what's going on sort of geologically in the world?
Sure. Yeah. So, the climate affecting geology happens, in my mind, it mostly happens through geomorphology. So if you think about
Okay.
like when it gets really cold, you have ice sheets across the northern hemisphere eroding everything down to bedrock, eroding deep valleys, and really just eroding everything in sight and dumping all of that sediment out into the ocean eventually.
Right.
And but the climate is also really important for other types of weathering. So, glaciers are physically weathering the landscape, but in the tropics, because it's raining so much, you have really intense chemical weathering, which affects the geology. And I think one really interesting thing is also like, how does the geology and how does plate tectonics affect the climate? It is sort of a feedback
Yeah.
cycle. So there is a theory that when you build mountains, when you have big mountain building events, you start to cool the climate. And that's because when chemical weathering occurs, that chemical reaction takes in CO2.
Right. And
So
I've tried to explain this a handful of times on the podcast in a way
okay.
that makes sense to the non-scientist
Yeah,
without just straight up going through the chemistry, which is not
it's
fun to
boring.
listen
No
to.
one wants to.
Uh,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and so I know I've heard it suggested a couple of times that the reason why any of the climate, maybe not any, but a large portion of the climate events in the last handful of million years happen is because the Himalayas.
Yep. So that's kind of the ongoing theory for cooling that's been happening for the whole Neogene, basically.
Right.
We've kind of
And
been
just for reference, really quick to the listeners, the Neogene is the last roughly 25 million years.
Yeah. And that trend actually started in the Paleogene, so like,
Right.
we've had this very long trend of cooling, over really the last 65 million years, with some blips. It hasn't
Yes.
been just straight down, but, yeah. And it's thought that, earlier on, I mentioned that, weather is kind of controlled by the atmosphere and climate is more the atmosphere and the ocean working together. It's really thought that those sort of really long-term climate changes must be controlled by geology. So if you lift up a big mountain range and you create all of these new surfaces for weathering to occur, because that weathering reaction takes in CO2, it's thought that by building a big mountain chain, you might take in enough CO2 over 65 million years to cool the climate. That's still kind of up for debate. There's a few competing theories as to why really the climate has been, what sort of geological mechanism best explains that cooling trend.
It also helps to have a continent on the poles.
Yes, so there's a few keys. You need a continent on the poles because you need to build ice. Because one of the most effective ways to change the climate is through the ice albedo feedback, which is basically if you have ice on the planet, it's very reflective and it reflects all the sunlight away. And if you grow a little bit more ice, it reflects more sunlight, which makes it colder, which makes you grow more ice, which makes it more reflective, which makes it colder, so you get into these feedbacks. So you do need, you need continents at the poles, somewhere to build ice. A mountain building event doesn't hurt. We actually don't really know, but it's kind of thought that, the Himalayas may have been kind of what triggered that cooling. And changing plate tectonics also changes ocean circulation. So closing or opening major ocean gateways. So one example is when the Antarctic ice sheet started forming about 35 million years ago, which coincides with approximately the time that South America actually separated from Antarctica.
Right.
And so it's thought that once, because of the way the ocean circulates, it used to have to go, around South America to get back to Antarctica. And once that passage opened, the ocean circulates pretty much just around Antarctica and has essentially isolated Antarctica. So that it's really difficult for heat to get into the Antarctic interior, which is why there's such persistent ice in Antarctica for such a long time.
Yeah. And so I guess we can't get away with this paleontology podcast without talking a little bit more about life, I think.
Yeah.
So what are some of the ways that climate affects life?
Sure. So I think, climate is one of, the main drivers of evolution. Life has to evolve to adapt to these climate changes, or go extinct, which also happens. There's major extinction events in Earth's history that are linked to climate change. So those are kind of the choices.
I'd say most of them.
Yeah.
with
maybe a trigger or two in there, a geological trigger or a giant meteor.
Right. The very notable one that kind of stands out even did come along with a lot of, funky climate stuff too.
Yeah. I mean, some people argue that was the main driver of the extinction, the event. It was this long drawn out climate change that was occurring in the background that then got sort of catalyzed by an impact. But yeah, I think, life has always adapted to climate. I think, human evolution, even, the evolution of our species is sort of thought to potentially be linked to changes in the climate. And, our ability to better adapt to climate change is kind of what made our species successful. So there's a lot of really interesting examples of climate impacting life and also life impacting climate. I mean, you think about once the first photosynthesizers evolved and started pumping oxygen into the atmosphere, it just radically changed the face of the planet by modifying the atmosphere. And even, on sort of a today,
right.
I think a lot about, when you look at the Keeling curve, which is, the hockey stick that everyone's seen of CO2 going up, it's got wiggles in it. And those wiggles are because of life. It's because in the Northern Hemisphere, when all of the plants start putting leaves on in the spring, they draw down all of that CO2. And we can see that in the atmospheric record. So I think life and climate have always been really, really closely linked.
Or even on a slightly more almost kind of meta level, when COVID hit and humans stopped doing stuff, CO2 emissions kind of tanked for like a year-ish.
Yeah. It wasn't enough to make too much of a difference, but they did definitely go down. And it's, I think we often like to think of ourselves and our society and whatnot as like sort of separate from that natural environment. But, we are kind of the biggest example of life. We're a product of evolution, and we're the best example of life impacting the climate, where we figured out this really ingenious way to provide energy for ourselves, which is to take fossil fuels out of the ground and combust them. And that is now going to have a very long-lasting effect on the climate system that will be apparent in the sedimentary records in, a million years, when maybe there'll be geologists taking some sediment cores in the ocean and measuring carbon isotopes and measuring plankton proxies and going, oh, yep, that's that, year 2000 climate anomaly that I've heard about once in grad school. So
yeah, and 10 million years when the cephalopod scientists are finally around.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So I want to end with a little bit of just picking your brain about things. So something that and just sort of we had talked about this off recording a couple days ago. Yeah. But so I know you're a Star Wars fan. And when I was going through undergrad, I had always sort of been told of a decent amount of periods in Earth's history. I've had them sort of explained as Star Wars planets.
Yeah.
And apparently you had not heard that, which was really funny to me.
I know. Well, I've always had like in my mind, those planets are kind of linked to Earth's history in my head, but I hadn't been taught that before. But it makes me think now I should teach that in my classes.
Yeah. But for example, listeners who are maybe a little bit less familiar with, things over the history of Earth, but times like the late Ordovician period, there was debated on whether it was a true snowball Earth, but nevertheless very icy. And that is, I've heard, compared to Hoth a lot. The Carboniferous period, which we've talked about, we had an entire episode about, in fact.
Oh, fun.
And where the entire planet was covered in rainforest, give or take. And that has been compared to Dagobah, the planet where Luke finds Yoda. And also, very quickly after that, there was very little rainforest anywhere, and it was very deserty when Pangaea came together in the Permian period. And I had that sort of explained to me like Tatooine. And as I sort of learned more and then thought more about the world today, I'm like, there must have been places or pockets that were not like that, had climates like that. And so I guess, is there a good way to sort of measure, global versus regional versus sort of local climate through deep time? And maybe all of those were Paleozoic examples, so maybe those aren't the best time periods to pick.
Yeah. So I think, there definitely is. And I think every proxy is good for different things. So I think, that there's been a big push to really try to quantify what is the global temperature sensitivity to CO2 changes, which is obviously of interest to everybody. However, if the global average temperature change is predicted, right now we're probably going to break 2 degrees. We might get up to 3. It might be even more. But, that global average doesn't mean much to the people in the Arctic where it's warming 4 times as fast.
Right.
So there's definitely, examples where we've been able to measure that in the past where the climate really is different regionally, versus globally. But I love to think that, there's entire planets out there, even in the imaginary universe, that are really just one climate, which is, not really something we see today. Like Mars even has different climate, and the poles and at the equator, right? So yeah, I think it's an interesting comparison for sure.
Yeah. All right. So that's pretty much all I have. Do you have anything else you'd like to touch on before we sign off?
I don't think so. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, of course. So where can the people find you?
Oh, the people can find me. Gosh, I mean, I have a website, I guess. But also, yeah, you can find me on Twitter also, Delta Deuterium, which is an isotope thing. Or at my website or my Bucknell website. If you have questions about climate, I'm always happy to talk about paleoclimate. So get in touch for sure.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I will have all of those things linked down below. And again, thank you so much for coming on and enlightening us about paleoclimate. I've been wanting to do a paleoclimate episode for a long time, but it's like a little too daunting for me to try to tackle just like in my free time.
Yeah, no, this was great, but you obviously also need a deep time paleoclimatologist. It's a whole different ball game.
That will be future episode coming maybe.
Yep. Sounds great. All right. Thanks, Gavin.
Once again, thank you so much to Dr. Lorelei Curtin. We will have our regularly scheduled episodes back up next week on Wednesday. And as I mentioned in our little sort of update, just letting you all know this is coming out Friday instead of Wednesday, we have some updates coming for you next week. So make sure you catch next week's episode. Some things we're going to be changing a little bit with the podcast. Nothing crazy, but I'll be able to lay out my thoughts a little more succinctly and to the actual, podcast crew next week. So hopefully you'll see us there. And definitely make sure to check out all of Lorelei's socials down below in the show notes. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you all next week. This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.